Collective bargaining. It's one of the hottest debates in college athletics right now. Could it fix the current issues? What would it take to organize it? And is it even possible, especially in a right-to-work state like Idaho? Welcome to this Broncos Studio special. I'm your host, Jay Tust. We're going to do our best to answer all of those questions with some of the more prominent minds right now in college sports. Coming up, Jim Cavall of Athletes.org will join the show, alongside Boise State Director of Athletics Jeremiah Dickey. Additionally, national writer Matt Brown of Extra Points and local Boise State Assistant Professor Sam Ehrlich will each share their thoughts on the matter. Why is this such a timely discussion? Recently, David Cobb of CBS Sports tweeted out a response to the collective bargaining from NCAA President Charlie Baker on X. Baker said, quote, "You'd have to get a federal law passed, first of all, in order to do that. Secondly, student athletes don't want to do that. Thirdly, when everybody says that, they don't talk about our scholarships now taxable under that arrangement." Baker then concluded, quote, "I'm a former governor, right? I negotiated with 60 unions. I know a lot about how collective bargaining works, what's in it, what's out of it, and all of the rest. Saying that it's a simple answer to this is not a legitimate response. It's just not." That's when University of Tennessee Athletic Director Danny White fired back saying, 1, you don't have to get a federal law passed. 2, nobody said collective bargaining would be simple. And 3, not pursuing all avenues to solve our dysfunctional system is negligent. With all that in mind, we begin the discussion with Jim Cavall of Athletes.org, the first free-to-join players association dedicated solely to representing, organizing, and educating college athletes. Alongside Boise State Director of Athletics, Jeremiah Dickey. Jim, we appreciate you joining the program today. Formerly the CEO and founder of Influencer, then it was on to Teamworks, and now you have started something new, Athletes.org. And Jim, first and foremost, I just want to know your passion for college sports.
I mean, my passion for college sports really comes down to my experience growing up as an athlete, aspiring to play college sports, and then actually doing it. And I didn't play for the glory at the big Division I level. I was a Division II athlete at the University of Montevallo in Alabama. And I'm from New York, so I trekked 1,000 miles away to chase my dream to play college baseball. And it shaped the rest of my life, right? It's where I learned how to be a leader. It's where I learned how to persevere. It's where I learned how to deal with hardships, but also help others through hardships. And ultimately, it gave me a passion that drove me as an athlete, and I just translated that into business, you know? And so college sports changed my life. And that's why I love working in it, because I think it still has some of those qualities, and things have changed, but there's a way to bring some of that back to the center, because that's what it's really all about.
I think, you know, we stand here today and we all love college sports and what they can mean, what they do for us, as you just said, right? But I also think we all understand, like, we need a path forward in college sports right now. So your latest endeavor, Athletes.org, what is it exactly? When did you come up with this idea, and what do you hope to achieve with it?
Yeah, so Athletes.org is the players association for college athletes. It's the first ever operating players association in the history of college sports. We have 5,200 athletes who are members of the players association, mostly power conference football and basketball, but a lot of athletes outside of that scope as well. And those 5,200 athletes get services such as free legal to review contracts, free accounting to do their taxes, agent background checks to pick an agent or a financial advisor. And we also poll them and engage them to get their perspective so we can share it with the market. And so, I came up with it really in 2022. I would travel a lot with my CEO role at Influencer throughout 22, because it was a year into NIL. And after a year of NIL, a lot of people were like, what is going on? Like, nobody really knew. You remember when Nico signed from California high school to go all the way to Tennessee for $8 million? Like, was that real? People didn't know. That's all they read in the press. There's so much mystique about what was going on. And I had built a company from 2017 to 2022 at that point that became the system of record, one of the systems of record for name, image, and likeness transactions. And so, Boise State and 220 other Division I schools used our software to house all the transactions athletes were getting from collectives, from brands, for NIL purposes. And we had about $100 million of data. So I would go around throughout 22 and I would speak to athletic directors at meetings like the FBS AD's meeting. It used to be called Lead One. And I'd show them, I say, hey, here's what's happening based on the data. And I'd show them that, 87% of the transactions that happened in the first year of NIL were ultimately pay for play disguised as NIL. It was money laundered by donors through a shell company called the Collective to pay players to play at your school, whatever school you lead. And the reason we were in that situation in 2022 where NIL was being manipulated to really be a disguise for pay for play is because in 2016, Ed O'Bannon beat the NCAA for the improper use of his name, image, and likeness. And when he won that lawsuit, there was an opportunity for leaders at that time to innovate, to be proactive, to rethink college athletics and what a system with NIL would look like. Instead, nobody did anything, and NIL just kind of happened to everyone. And so I would give that talk, and it was always very respectful and don't kill the messenger. This is just what I see based on the data and based on my research. And I would also start talking about new court cases. There was Johnson versus the NCAA, which is about employment via the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act. There was Carter, Hubbard, and House versus the NCAA. They were all similar. They had to do with past NIL damages, but also all these cases back in 22 were writing on the wall that this NIL way of paying athletes from donor money wasn't going to be the future. The future was going to be the schools paying the athletes directly. And so I'd give that talk, and a lot of athletic directors would push back during the Q&A, some of them telling me they'll retire before they ever pay athletes directly, and some of them have. And so, I realized by the end of 22 that I was banging my head against the wall. In 2016, I was really minding my own business in Birmingham, Alabama, where I live, building a 47 gym fitness chain. And the only reason I sold that to start Influencer was because of the Ed O'Bannon case. And I felt like I was back in that situation where at that time I was 5 years before NIL when it's 2016, and I'm selling my company to now build a new software business in the college space, betting that NIL happened. I was back there again in 22 where I had sold my company Influencer to Teamworks. I had a really good, comfortable financial situation, both from the sale and from my C-level role at Teamworks. But I just felt like this is where this is going, and somebody's got to build it. And so ultimately for schools to pay players and compensate them without litigation, for there to be transfer rules, for there to be any structures that everybody wants, athletes, parents, and leaders and coaches and fans. Those structures, academic standards, eligibility limits, all of them need to be collectively bargained so that there can be rules set that the athletes and the schools agree to, and they can't continuously be litigated. There's actually a certainty and a sustainability to college athletics. The only other route is Congress, which I don't believe is a real route. I believe it's a pipe dream. So that's why I started this, because you have to have an entity that represents the athletes in that collective bargaining negotiation. And I've created that with Brandon Copeland and our team at athletes.org. We're still waiting for the leaders in college sports to create their entity to bargain with the athletes, because athletes will not bargain school by school. And we'll get into that later, but there needs to be a league entity. And that's where I think collective bargaining actually becomes realistic.
Well, I certainly want to dive into collective bargaining, but before we get there, everybody's seeking transparency right now, right? And as it pertains to that, Jeremiah Dickey, I don't know, what do you think of the work that Jim has done? And, obviously that there's a previously existing relationship there with having worked with one of Jim's companies before, but what do you think of the work that Jim has done, Jeremiah?
Yeah, I mean, I've known Jim since he started Influencer, and very grateful for him. And I think we can all agree our industry is in need of bold leadership. And I think Jim is stepping in at a time that is very chaotic, uncomfortable in many ways. And he said two things that it's relevant to us and me and our industry. And I think a lot of leaders, don't want to speak for all ADs, but the level of certainty and sustainability that we're looking for. I say it a lot publicly, Jay. The bottom is when you stop digging, and what I'm specifically looking for, and very much appreciate Jim being here today and talking through some of this, because I don't have all the answers, but is that level of certainty and sustainability, because I care very much about this industry. I care about our why, which is to prepare our student athletes for life, and I think that's a differentiating factor between us and maybe the professionalized sport when you look at NBA and NFL, and how can we have our cake and eat it too in that regard. And I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying there's not more work to be done, and I think Jim would probably agree with that and be able to say the same thing. But I also agree that I'm not sure federally that's a solution yet. I think there's some work that we can do as an industry on our end that maybe tease up some of the things that we would need the federal government to get involved with, but that's probably a different conversation.
Well, I mean, it is kind of part of the similar conversation, though, and I guess, Jim, let's kind of start there real quick, because like the political temperature when it comes to collective bargaining and how you got to get a lot of states on the same page with various rules, like how does that play into this?
Well, listen, first of all, I'm going to share a lot of knowledge from my perspective today. I do not think I have all the answers, but I think that there's a lot of people at the commissioner and even president or AD level that say some things that confuse people on this topic. And there are answers to the things that they say. Example, to your question, you hear that you cannot collectively bargain if you're in a right to work state. You also hear that employment at the school level would not work in a right to work state or a red state in general. These two things are not issues whatsoever. The two reasons that schools are so scared of employment are, number one, costs. Payroll taxes, workers' comp, minimum wage, overtime. And number two, politics. They're in a right to work state, and they're worried about what that will do. If there was a league, a central entity, we just heard Kirk Herbstreit talk and say a lot of the same stuff I've said a million times on FOS during the Super Bowl.
And then let's put a new governing body. Let's put a commissioner. If we need to unionize the players to allow them to create a CBA, to avoid the antitrust laws, make the rules, come to an agreement like the NFL does on both sides. I just think that's the only way.
I don't know if it's one league with all of FBS or two leagues like he said. Point is this: the league will employ the athletes directly. So now the schools aren't employing the athletes taking on those costs. And the league will directly, collectively bargain with the athletes, not the schools. And so when you look at the examples that exist in pro sports, you see that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers might be in a right to work state, but the players don't collectively bargain with the Bucs. They collectively bargain with the NFL. And that's all pro sports. And so is this pro sports? One-to-one? No, it's different. But is there a professionalized aspect to this that we've got to match with how it's structured? Yeah, and this is how you do it. And so, from a political standpoint, I have tried in DC to show political leaders a bipartisan solution for this. The only place I really think we need their help is to provide a path for non-employee status college athletes to be able to collectively bargain. Because right now in America, with the law we have, you have to be an employee to unionize and collectively bargain so that there's a protection for the employees and there's an antitrust exemption for the entity collectively bargaining with the employees. We won't get that if athletes aren't employees. So the only other option is create a new law. And Congress could do that. We've written a bill, a discussion draft, and the bill is simpler than any bill that's out there. All the other bills, they're trying to solve all the rules. We got to have this for eligibility. We got to figure out this for transfer rules. We got to figure. These are people that don't know a lot about college athletics that are trying to write all the rules in a bill. That's not what we need in a bill. We need a bill to create a path for the athletes and the schools to figure out the rules. And there's a way to do it without the athletes being employees. And we started meeting with Democrats about it, and guess what? It's a non-starter because all the Democrats want employment and collective bargaining. And then we met with the Republicans about it, and it was a non-starter because all the Republicans want no employment and no collective bargaining. Even though this compromise of no employment with collective bargaining was the one that actually had the most overlap between both sides of the aisle. And so that showed me that DC is pretty slim to none chance to solve this. And SCORE Act and other things you could use are only further evidence of that. And that's why I think where we end up is separation of certain sports into their own leagues with employment directly to the athletes and collective bargaining in the manner I described. That's the only way within the current law to solve the problems.
I mean, you see varying opinions. As you just said right there, some are in favor of making athletes employees, some are against it. I mean, obviously the easiest answer, it seems like, would be to turn them into employees, and that would create a path towards collective bargaining, or a straighter path. Could you explain both sides of it, though, Jim, and why would people be for or against, employment status for athletes?
Well, first of all, it's just it's a huge change. We've already changed this thing a lot, but what? Employees? That's just for some people, it's a really, really big change, number one. Numbers 2 and 3 are the cost and political reasons that I already mentioned. So those are 3 reasons why they would be against it. The reasons they would be for it is because when you see a situation like Mensa at Duke or the quarterback Williams at Washington, what you have is a really, really big hole that an agreement is being signed between a player and his or her institution for the use of their name, image, and likeness. And a lot of these are exclusive deals, so you can't go to a competitive institution and get the same deal. But the reality is they have nothing to do with them playing their sport. And they're not employment agreements either. They're contractor agreements. And that is why technically Mensa can unenroll at Duke and enroll at Miami. Now, Miami might have to find a creative way to pay him. If they're going to pay him directly from the school, it might be a conflict with his Duke contract, right? So what did they do? They settled for whatever they settled for so that they can pay him directly. But maybe they didn't settle. Let's say they didn't settle. If they didn't settle, Mensa could probably still have done a deal outside of Miami that Miami could set up for him to go there, right? Because the reality is there is no transfer portal. That is a marketing ploy. It's a set of dates that they try to tell athletes and parents, this is when you can transfer. The reality is you can unenroll and enroll outside of those dates. And you're not tied by an employment contract to provide your services to play football or any other sport based on how these contracts are being written. Employment would solve all of that. Picture a world where, keep imagining that league, right? Let's say there's an FBS football league. And the FBS football league employs all 136 teams of athletes directly. The athletes are employees of the college football league. And in this model, the athletes collectively bargain through athletes.org and the college football league to set all the rules. What would some of the rules be? Well, first of all, there'd be a standardized employment contract that every school would use, okay, off of the league. So the league would employ the athletes, the school would retain his or her services as part of this football league model. So one template. So, and that's negotiated by athletes.org and the college football league, and everybody's using a consistent template, number one. Number two, I bet there'd probably be a rookie max, where athletes that are coming in can only make a certain amount until their second year with an incentive pool if they outperform it. I also would assume there'd probably be a 2-year minimum for first-year players, so they'd have to commit to play for 2 years and they'd be under an employment contract. And I would assume that a veteran's bonus would be in place for guys who decide to stay. I would also assume that there'd be academic standards that they have to hit to be able to honor their contract. And I know that they would all agree to eligibility limits because that's taking spots from athletes. The reason I know these things is because the player reps from each of the 136 teams would probably not be freshmen. They'd probably be juniors or seniors, and they would want all the things that I just said. And I know that because we've met with them at the CFP the last few years, right? And we've gotten in a room and talked about these things. So the reality is that league I just described, I didn't get into scheduling and how you keep traditions and how the playoff works and the fact that it could have one media deal and make a lot more money. I left that out. But what I did say, a lot of those things are what fans want. They're what athletes want. They're what schools want. And everybody wins. The only people that are really taking advantage of the current system are the top 1% athletes. The other 99% need a system like I'm talking about just as much as the schools or everyone else do. And The top 1% need more protections too. When it comes to agents that are representing them, once again, through a union, there'd be an agent registry or certification program to make sure that agents are charging within a certain fee structure, right? So this is a win-win for everyone, and the two sides aren't even as far apart as I think a lot of people think.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up to that in just a second, Jim, but I want to get Jeremiah's take on something really quick. I mean, Jeremiah, what do you think of student athletes becoming employees? I mean, Jim suggested a lot of transparency and some guardrails right there. What would that potentially mean as we move forward, towards this path of the future of college football?
Yeah, I mean, and Jim spoke to it. I don't know all the ins and outs and the legal ramifications of whether they're employees or not, but everything that he just described, I think you'd be hard-pressed trying to find someone in the industry that wouldn't want that. We're looking for solutions, and if that gives us a path towards something that is sustainable and consistent in nature, I'm not sure why, Jay, we wouldn't want that to be part of the conversation. I think what I've tried to do over the course of time is curiously question everything. What I can tell you sitting here today is that it is chaos. I don't care what the viewership numbers are, and that there's a short runway for most schools, and maybe outside of the 1%, which probably ties into the 1% athletes that Jim's talking about. I'm not sure how much longer we all can go in the current setup. And I would also assume, and maybe more of a question for Jim, that attorneys are teeing up some of these employment lawsuits and what that looks like as we look ahead, including Title IX lawsuits. I think the litigation is endless. And so when I think about, are they employees, are they not, understanding it can get political, I want what's best for our industry. I want unity. I want us all to be playing from the same playbook and to truly define whatever that path is, and probably leads to a question, and based off what Jim just said, what is, understanding there are a lot of moving pieces, Jim, what is the natural next step for us to really unite around something? When you think about the number of ADs, presidents, institutions, conferences, what is something that gets us going in the right direction? Because everything you're saying, everything I've said publicly, it's easy to identify the problems. It's all right, now we're working towards the solutions. What is low-hanging fruit to get us going down a road that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I think the impetus, the catalyst is the better word to all of this, is the top 10 to 15 big brand schools and their presidents really getting their head around these things. As you know very well from your career in college athletics, like the dynamic between the president and the AD is a very important one, but it's also really difficult, right? Like I have a lot of empathy for guys and gals that are in your role, in your seat, when you have your contract and you're tied to a certain term, and then you have a president that might be on a different term, and you're trying to make decisions for athletics, but the president needs to be on board. At the same time, the president, in most cases, probably is only putting 10% or so of their time into athletics, and they're trusting the athletic director to run it. And there's this balance. And I think that is a bottleneck that has been one part of getting us here is we need presidents to understand this. And a lot of presidents at state institutions, they basically work for the governor. And when you think about politics, that's why it's so important in this. And so once again, I have empathy for them, but man, if they just knew that the state politics didn't have anything to do with collective bargaining, wow, that would be a good gem for presidents to know. And I've met with presidents and talked about this with them, with other people smarter than me, attorneys and such from our side, and they get it. And so we just need to educate, I think, the presidents. And I mentioned the big brand schools because everybody says that the Big Ten and SEC commissioner are the ones that are really in charge of this whole thing, and they have all the power. And I disagree. I think the power lies in the schools that drive the majority of the viewership in college football. And I think that all the college football schools have a share in the power. I just think that, the top 15 or so have a really, really big influence. And I think if they wanted to go start a new league and do it this way, and they even gave everyone else the opportunity to come along and join, I think they would. And I think it would happen. And I don't think it would take commissioner approval for it to happen. I think it would just happen. And of course, in that scenario that I went through, there'd only be one league. So there'll only be one commissioner. And so you start to wonder why 4 commissioners and 4 conferences maybe aren't thinking this way. Well, because they're entrusted right now by their presidents to think a different way. And once again, I have empathy for that. But we need somebody to step up. When Pete Rozelle put together the NFL merger, it was not an easy thing. It took 5 years. And a lot of people need to study what happened. First lesson is the Giants, my favorite team still to this day, their owner, Mara, had the most to lose because they were going to an equal media revenue share deal. And the Packers had the most to gain because they were the smallest market. But Wellington Mara made a sacrifice because he could see the bigger picture. He said, you know what? We'll take 3 steps backwards because we're going to take 15 forwards. And they've taken more than 15 forwards since, right? And they made that sacrifice. Another thing that happened was Pete Rozelle voluntarily put unionization into the plan for the NFL in exchange for an antitrust exemption that they still have today. And it makes them the most powerful league on the planet with no accountability. They do more than $20 billion in revenue a year with no board of directors, no K1s, no 10Qs, antitrust exempt. And why? They voluntarily put unionization and collective bargaining into the NFL plan in 1966 when it started. The other leagues, the NBA and the MLB, players had to go through hell to get unions started. Curt Flood, Major League Baseball, Oscar Robertson, NBA. Not in NFL. They voluntarily did it. Last point I'll make on that. Ironically, the billionaires who own the 32 NFL teams probably hate unionization in their other businesses, but they love it in the NFL. It works. So just think about that as you're thinking about this. We need leaders to think that way now in this environment, the way that Rozelle and the others thought back then.
With what the work you're doing at athletes.org, you would know the answer to this, but some of these athletes right now, they can get paid through the front door, the back door, and nobody's really regulating it, it seems. So if athletes have that freedom, why would they benefit from potential collective bargaining moving forward?
Why would they want it? Yeah. So I think first of all, when you have a structure that you're coming into that's set. So for instance, you're a freshman, right? And you're coming into a structure. You're going to enter that structure and you're going to learn what the rules are and learn how it all works and maybe have an agent to help you do that. And you're not going to be able to change the structure until there's another collective bargaining agreement that's up. And at that point, if you decide to be a player rep, you'll have a vote and be able to participate in how that ends up, right? There might be some things in your first couple of years you want to change and you fight for that as a player rep. So first of all, I think it's going to take athletes now who, I'll give you one reason, are being pushed into the portal because they're not performing well. And their coach is taking advantage of the portal the same way that some athletes take advantage of the portal to make more money. And so we see this portal full of thousands of athletes that end up with no home. And everybody's like, oh, these greedy athletes, they went into the portal trying to get more money, and little did they know the grass wasn't greener. They should have stayed where they're at. Well, what you don't know as a fan is their coach told them, you'll never play it down here at this university again. That's why they went into the portal. And so the protections for athletes under a contract to survive a certain term, to be able to maybe grow their game and be able to get on the field and get to a next contract is one reason. The ways agents are taking advantage of athletes is another reason. The fact that, and not all agents, by the way, take advantage of athletes. There's just some that are, right? Like the agents who are registered with the NFLPA or MBPA, they're doing a great job in college and they shouldn't be put in that bucket. But there are agents who take advantage of athletes, and collective bargaining would help athletes be protected against them. Health and safety and the bigger benefits that athletes don't know they need but really do need are so important. You know, my partner, Brandon Copeland, who's our executive director, played 10 years in the NFL. He always jokes when he got to the NFL as an undrafted free agent to the Baltimore Ravens, he would have played for a pack of double mint gum. But the NFLPA came in, and there was not only a minimum, but they, from a payment standpoint, but there was a lot of other structures that helped him get set up over time as he continued to be in the league for all kinds of benefits that athletes don't know they need, but they should have. I could keep going, but there's so many things like that. And I also think the cap would really be set up a lot better and a lot fairer. I mentioned rookie and veteran, incentives earlier. I just think that the cap would not be as volatile as it is today. It would be set up the right way because it would be for real compensation to play. So there's a lot of reasons athletes would want collective bargaining today, and 99% of them is an easy decision. But yeah, I wanted to acknowledge the top 1%, they are taking advantage of the fact that there's no rules, but they still could use these protections.
Yeah. I just think you look at the strain that some of this has on individual athletic departments, and Jeremiah, when you hear these, again, I'm going to describe them as guardrails. Do you view those as daunting, or do you view them as necessary, I guess?
100% necessary. And once again, is only speaking for myself. We look at what the House settlement, what we thought it was going to do, which was create a cap. Inherently, it created a floor, and now many of us are trying to achieve that, and it's opened up to the, as you said, Jay, the money through the front and back and side doors and whatever other door there is, and there really aren't parameters that have been defined, and maybe if they have, there definitely aren't punitive, outcomes to bypassing it, and you've seen a lot of schools be very public, in terms of what they're doing, and I feel, and maybe it's a little bias on my side, God willing, I have another 15, 20 years of doing this. I care too much about our industry and the impact that I can have on as a leader and my coaches and staff on the impact to these student athletes and truly preparing them for life. And so hearing Jim talk about, keeping someone here for 2 years and impacting them, and maybe they stay and maybe not based on whatever the rules are that we all get to decide based on the new setup, that it would at least give us additional runway, Jay, to be able to lock into that why, and that's something I'm still holding on to, and maybe it's unrealistic of me, but I believe in what we represent, and it's something bigger than ourselves, and and I want to continue to have that impact, and I think about the two student athletes, DeMarcus and George, winning a Super Bowl, and the reality is I'm not sure they would have been here for 4 years if the rules would have changed at that point in time, and I think there's something special to see a community really embrace that, and there were a lot of Hawks fans because of that, and and I think that ties into the brand, the brotherhood, and what we represent. So I do see that it creating a much more realistic path, and at least a transparent one, with guardrails that we can all protect each other in the process, and that includes the student athletes who represent themselves.
Yeah, I think sometimes we forget about the journey too. I mean, you bring up DeMarcus Lawrence and George Holani. I covered both of them here at Boise State. DeMarcus came from a junior college, and Chris Peterson and his staff turned him into a second-round draft pick that has now lasted over a decade in the NFL and built off, those values, was a Super Bowl champion last night. George Holani came here as a highly touted true freshman, played immediately, had 1,000 yards, went through a career where injuries at times knocked him off the field for months, but there was still a level of loyalty there just because that's what the rules were back then, right? He couldn't just freely leave and transfer, and Boise State just couldn't necessarily freely deflect him off the team because he was injured, and now he perseveres and he's a Super Bowl champ. Jim, you brought up back in the day, it took the NFL about 5 years to figure this thing out. The best you can do, what's a realistic timeline, and how long is the runway that we can survive in chaos, I guess, hoping that, there are results at the end of this thing? Yeah,
I mean, I hope that it takes It comes from a catalytic event from great leaders doing what we talked about, creating a new entity structure for college football, maybe also for college basketball, and maybe for Olympic sports. And those probably have to be 3 separate entities, but I think you got to start with college football, and doing a lot of the things that I mentioned would work within the current law. Mm-hmm. 1 league, 1 commissioner, 1 employer, 1 collective bargaining agreement, 1 media deal. I think those would really bring more revenue, fixed costs, and rules that can be governed without litigation to college football, right? So I think a catalytic leader or leaders to step up and create that for others to follow, I think that could happen in the next year or 2. I think if you wait, it won't be catalytic, it'll be catastrophic. And what I mean is if I told you a year ago that college athletes were going to do what Mensa just did, and that Miami would spend $10 million between his sister's scholarship to come from Oregon to play soccer and the buyout or whatever the settlement was with Duke and his, NIL deal with Miami and everything else. If I would have told you about that situation, you said, wow, well, that's crazy, right? But that's just part of the norm now. And next year, maybe an athlete will try to just transfer and play in the same season, Maybe there's athletes who are going to do the unthinkable that people have always wondered if it would ever happen, boycott a game. I don't know. But at the end of the day, the longer you wait, whether it's the stuff like that people are concerned with, or whether it's just the money running out, because at a power conference school that's not performing well in football, but shelling out $20 million a year that they're asking the institution to loan the athletic department to be able to pay athletes, but they went 3-10 again. Maybe the school's just like, we're done. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So and 20 million isn't even the cap anymore. Right. It's the floor, right? So it's just, I think catalytic is what we need. We need a catalytic leader or leaders to lead on this from the school side. And I think that could happen in the next 12 to 24 months. I think if you wait longer than that, you start to get up towards 2030, I think there's going to start being drop-offs, because I just don't think people can afford it.
Well, Jeremiah, somebody that runs an athletic department, what do you think of that timeline?
No, I think he's right on, and I think the solutions we need as an industry, it's the next 12 to 24 months, as he said. But I do believe our industry is on the fast track, specifically from an FBS standpoint. And you're hearing a lot more talk about the Power 2, Power 4, all of the above potentially breaking away, and I think what Jim is proposing could tie into that, and because there are media rights deals up at the end of this decade. And I felt like, we had 5 years, and speaking for Boise State, we had to survive the day in some ways and find a way to succeed, to stay as close as possible, because we know change is coming. And change is, it's a funny thing, it's so much better when you embrace it versus it being forced on you. And I think our industry is at that crossroads of, that chaos Jim's speaking of, because I feel it. And as I talk to more ADs, they're feeling it as well. And the institutions, are struggling in many ways. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, whether it's enrollment cliffs and how higher ed is viewed. I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but I feel like, it's the definition of perfect storm. And if we continue to approach it with the insanity that we have, we're going to get the same thing that we've been getting. And we need to push as leaders in this industry, and understanding I know what I represent here, and I know the brand that I have. And probably why I'm so willing to go out on the limb, knowing that limb could break, but I also don't see another solution. And I would rather, I don't sleep much anyways, but I can sleep, at least a little bit more, knowing that I feel I'm fighting for what's best for an industry that I care very much about, and I've seen the impact that it's had on those that I serve. And so we got to keep fighting and keep working towards these solutions, as Jim said. And I appreciate him and his willingness to go out on that limb. And and stand up for what he feels is right. And there is no perfection to this. If there was, then I think we would have had solutions a long time ago. I think there's a lot to consider, and it's not an indictment on any one commissioner or president or AD or group of ADs. This has been building for probably 3 decades, Jim, right? And I think we're now at this place that when everything's on fire and you have one cup of water, where do you throw it? And we got to figure it out, because I do think it will get worse before it gets better if we don't.
Full of analogies there, JD. Jim, how many athletes do you say that you work with at athletes.org right now?
We just passed 5,200 members.
Okay. I've had conversations when it comes to collective bargaining that, there's opinions that it would have to come from the players in order to really jumpstart this thing. Do you see a tipping point there? And what is their level of importance when it comes to it?
I don't think this will be a players up movement.
Okay.
I think it'll be a teams or schools down movement, kind of like the NFL. So players up examples would be, NBA, Oscar Robertson and Bob Pettit organize a sit out of the 1964, I think it was, All-Star game, because the owners got a new media deal and we're going to honor the pensions that the players had asked for, right? That was kind of the beginning of a 10-year journey to get the NFL or the NBPA to happen, right? And baseball, similar. Football happened opposite, right? I mentioned that earlier. The teams and the commissioner, Pete Rozelle, put it in the deal. I think that's how it's going to happen here. I think that college athletes have a lot on their plate right now, and their experience is a lot different than the one I described as a Division II athlete 20 years ago, and so they are professional, whether we want to admit it or not, in a lot of ways, how they have to carry themselves, how they have to manage themselves, money, things that we didn't have when we were playing college sports or playing high school sports, right? So I think it's unrealistic to think that players are the ones that are going to, start this by sitting out of games. And that's why we haven't pushed for that to happen. They have done lawsuits, right? We've seen that. And I think players will continue to test the system with lawsuits when it helps them in specific ways, like eligibility, like we saw with Diego Pavia, or we're now seeing with the Tennessee quarterback. But I really think this is a top-down initiative that the league that's formed realizes they need this. And it's going to help create sustainability. And the athletes get a great deal out of it, because finally they have the protections that they've needed all along in this to negotiate the very best deal for them.
I think too, Jim, and would love your thoughts on this. We talk a lot about, Olympic sport programs, and you could venture to say that this current system that we're in, started in football, it's dominoed into men's and women's basketball, and then you have this Olympic sport category that, is being impacted. You're seeing institutions drop sports, and I don't know if it's going to get more or less, when you think about the financial stability of our industry. But that's something that I feel going down a road where we can create some solutions specific to FBS or whatever we end up creating that would positively benefit the Olympic sport programs and how we serve and the experience they have that sometimes gets lost in this, because yes, there are athletes out there, from an NIL standpoint or rev share that maybe are doing well in those sports. But it doesn't seem possible that institutions are going to be able to sustain the level of support that they currently have for Olympic sport programs, considering the cost of doing business. And it almost requires this resetting of the table specific to football that will positively impact all sports.
There's no doubt. And I mean, really the way I like to look at it is if you separate these sports into their own league entities. So football has its own league entity, men's and women's basketball has its own, and then Olympic sports has its own. From there, the schools are still going to have to comply with Title IX when it comes to the benefits that they're offering the athletes directly. These are not compensation benefits. That's coming from the league, right? But benefits like scholarships and living conditions and travel and whatever it is, right? And I think there's a way to continue to have equity in those benefits, while these leagues, based on the revenue produced, will provide compensation that's pro rata, based on the revenue being produced. And I think that does such a great job of separating a lot of the issues people bring up with Title IX, because the money for compensation comes from an outside entity that's the commercial league entity, And so I think we got to get to a point where we're thinking that way, because you're right. Like, these other sports are very important, but we're not going to be able to fund them the same way we have for the last century, because for the last century, football players weren't getting paid. So there was a lot of money from football to go finance these sports. That's not the case anymore. So we've got to think about how to grow the pie so that there's more revenue and there's a way to afford everything.
It's interesting you said that in terms of, and I think, Jay, you and I have talked about this before, but when you think about rev share, there's a much smaller percentage of college athletic programs out there that actually are sharing revenue. It's become an expense, when you think about how we're paying. And some of that is due to, the decisions we've made in the past, and we continue to live that out in action, whether it's contracts or, whatever it may be. But there really isn't a lot of revenue to share outside of a handful of schools out there. And ultimately, I do believe it's going to domino into the Olympic sport programs, and in some ways already has. So,
Jim, we can get you out of here on this one. And I'm just curious, simply put, how important is it just to have these discussions and to educate? And I know you've done a lot of work so far. Are you encouraged or discouraged about where things currently stand?
I think that I've thought a lot about this, first of all. So, it's funny that you're asking me it. I think that if 3 years ago now is when I started athletes.org. If 3 years ago you'd have told me that, we'd be where we are today, both as an association and a team and an athlete community, but also the industry would be in this situation. And I think I would be encouraged because I think it shows that there's a need for the solution that we set out to build from the beginning. On the other side, what you brought up about the importance of discussion, it's discouraging that we're just now getting there, Jeremiah is one of, I can count on two hands, the leaders of schools in FBS football that were willing to talk about this stuff 3 years ago when we started, right? Bubba Cunningham's another one, Danny White, the usual suspects. Jeremiah is one of those guys that was like, yeah, we got to talk about it. We got to, what's wrong with sharing ideas? I've had others who I used to be very close with that told me, I don't ever want to talk to you again because of what we're doing with athletes.org, just because I see a different route than them. And that's changed and softened over the last 3 years. A lot of those folks have come back around, and now they're finally ready to just talk. But I'm a firm believer that if you got all the right people in a room right now, and you locked us in a room for 8 hours and told us figure it out, with what we've built and what a lot of those leaders know, I think we could figure it out one day. I don't think it's novel. I don't think it's new. It's stuff that's already being done. It's stuff that already works. It's stuff that's already within the current law. You just can't get the right people in a room. And that's why we're here.
Jeremiah, could you help him figure it out in a day?
I definitely am open to talking about it, Jay.
Yeah.
It's obviously I'm vocal and uncomfortably so. And Jim, you said it. I'm not the smartest in the room, but I do care about this industry, and I think the onus is on us as leaders to be bold and go out on the limb, because at this point, what do we have to lose? I care about it, and I want I want to create a sustainable model for the 350 plus student athletes that I'm so honored and grateful to represent, and I know we're having an impact on their life, and that's important to me. And I think being bold and having these conversations, very, very much appreciate, Jim, you jumping on with us. My hope is that it does pull at the heartstrings, or maybe even hits a nerve, and let's debate, or let's get it out there publicly, because so many of these conversations, and when Jim first brought this up, and him and I had talked about it 3 years ago, everything was behind closed doors. You're seeing it be more public now because the industry, it's escalated, and regardless of viewership numbers and success, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I think most leaders would agree that we're not in a good place, but that there also are solutions, and it's on us to be able to discuss it publicly and put our best foot forward, and at minimum curiously question what we're doing, why we're doing it, and where we potentially could go with it. And I do believe if we could get the right people in the room, we could knock this out very easily. And that's, I think those are the hurdles still ahead of us, and I maybe have too much faith that we're going to figure this out.
Well, Jim, we greatly appreciate your time. Before I let you go, just kind of a funny question. I mean, we all follow sports on social media now, and just so often it just, something happens and we all throw our hands in the air, and then we all go to Twitter and react, or whatever it might be. When those chaotic moments come up, how do you view them? I mean, on one hand, they probably make one want to bang their head against the wall. On the other hand, it almost seems like it's a necessary evil. So how do you view them at times?
I think it's a necessary evil. I think that, chaos is helping people realize the insanity of trying to operate an old model in a modern day, and it's a square peg, round hole evidence every time you see these chaotic situations.
Well, Jim, we greatly appreciate your time today. Jeremiah, thank you for stopping by Broncos Studios. It's obviously an important conversation, and I think once we talk about it, you realize how complex it is, but you also realize there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We just got to get to the light. So, Jim, we appreciate you joining us today.
Amen.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jay. Opportunity and chaos. Go Broncos.
In order to get another opinion on this topic, we turn our attention to the work of Matt Brown, an independent sports journalist who runs the website extrapointsmb.com. His work focuses specifically on off-the-field topics in college sports, including business and policy. Matt, welcome to the show. Before we get down to business, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great. It's always a little bit surreal when I'm on the other end of these kind of interview conversations, but I'm happy to do it. Happy to be spending some time here with you guys today.
Hey, a couple years ago, you traveled up. You had a chance to watch a game on the Blue. What was your reason for that trip, and what was the takeaway from your experience here at Boise State?
Yeah, so I'm based in Chicago, so I don't have the budget or the opportunity to travel out west maybe as often as I would like. A couple of years ago, I had a full trip planned to spend some time in Pullman and Wazoo, to spend some time a little bit north of the state at the University of Idaho, and then some time in Boise. And I wanted to go and not just talk with some of these ADs and see the Blue and everything myself, but wanted to get an idea for how an athletic department remains engaged with fans when, hey, maybe the Big 12 didn't work out, or you can win and you win and you win and you do all these things within your control, and realignment doesn't break your way. And heaven knows this fan base has been told no, despite what they've done on the field a lot of different times. And what I saw was something that I think is uncommon in a lot of the other larger places where I've traveled and where I've written about, where fans were still deeply engaged and deeply engaged because of what the program and the athletes in the school meant to them and their city and their state, and controlling what they could control, and knowing that if things don't work out and the proverbial big boys don't want them, well, you've been beating them for the last 15 years. Why can't you keep eating? Why not this year too? And that's really what happened.
It seems like a simple question, Matt, and maybe it should be better, it could be asked, later on in this conversation, but why is fan engagement so important?
I think sometimes we forget when we're in this business of either covering college athletics or running it or everything else. Yes, this is an enterprise that helps bring new people into higher education and make new people aware of what's happening on campus with education with Boise State. But it's not all of this only works if fans care about it, if people want to go and watch the team and go to the stadium and then be connected to everything else. And there are a lot of schools in this country that might have had a 100-year head start on Boise State and might have big TV contracts and fancy brands and some of this other institutional, advantages, but they don't really have fans, or their engagement with fans is trading off of something good that might have happened 20 years ago or 22 or 25 years ago. You have to constantly sell yourself to a new generation of people that don't remember the Oklahoma Fiesta Bowl, people that don't remember some of the things that happened 6 or 7 years ago. And that's not something that I think every athletic department in the country, big, medium, or small, does very effectively. And if you don't have that community behind you, a lot of the other stuff you're doing is moot, in my opinion.
Boise State has sold out every single regular season game, specifically over the last 2 years, right? So it's there. Matt, going into your background, extrapointsmb.com, the initials obviously stand for Matt Brown. When did you come up with the idea of Extra Points, and why did you want to lean into, when everybody's focusing on maybe more on the field stuff, you shifted to kind of off the field stuff?
I did, and I wish I could tell you guys that I started this business out of a stroke of like entrepreneurial wisdom, where I decided I wanted to, throw off these editors and these people that were holding me back. To honest to God, I started Extra Points in April of 2020 because I was desperate. It was a little bit different out here in your neck of the woods. In Chicago, everything shut down for COVID. And that meant live sports. That meant a lot of other businesses. I had been working for Vox Media for 7 years before then, and then I got laid off. And all of my backup plans were also closed. So I went into business for myself originally. I tell people because I didn't want to work behind the deli counter. And the grocery store was the only other place in my neighborhood that was hiring. And I had a wife and kids and a mortgage and a dog to go pay for. But I wanted to write about this kind of work specifically because I think there are a lot of very talented reporters covering college athletics who are increasingly spread very thin between going to all the press conferences and media availability and practices and traveling alongside the team, figuring out which 16-year-olds are going to go pick your school. There's to do all of those things. And with smaller staffs than you might have had a decade ago, there's a lot of stories that get untold. You're not necessarily filing the open records requests or going through the financial baggage or interviewing some of these athletic vendor companies or the university president, not because you're not interested in it, but because your audience and your publication require you be laser focused on what happens on the field. And I care about all those things, but I think I try to be very upfront about what kind of expertise I have. There's a lot of people in this country that know ball better than I do. But because I can be so focused on how the athletic department's connected to the school and the community and to Congress and to television deals and all these other factors, my hope is that gives consumers and other reporters a lane to talk about some of these other things, and then they can focus a little bit more on what happens on the field.
I mean, that's a big reason why we invited you on, is because you've taken the time to dive into so many of these topics, and I think one topic that is looming large right now is the idea of collective bargaining. So, I mean, just broadly, what is your thought on collective bargaining and how it could impact college football?
Sure. I absolutely understand why more athletic directors and broadcasters and people that we might consider to be more management in this world are talking about that more. Because if you're a fan of Bronco athletics or just a fan of college sports, I talk to a lot of people who express some frustration with how unpredictable and unstable things can be. You don't necessarily know who's going to be on your roster from 1 year to another. You don't really know how much any athlete is being paid either by a school or by anybody else. The idea of what eligibility rules were also seemed to be coming into question. Now, maybe you could even play professionally for a little while and come back. And part of the reason that all these things keep happening is because the NCAA and the individual schools and the individual conferences increasingly don't have the legal authority to set restrictions on how athlete compensation or eligibility works, because then they are sued and increasingly are found that they have violated antitrust law. And the reason that pro football and pro basketball and so many other sports that people here and across the country enjoy are able to have more stable and secure rules about when free agency happens or how people are paid or how that stuff is tracked is through a collective bargaining agreement where management and labor get together and they argue until 3 o'clock in the morning, right to the absolute deadline, and then they hash out some rules that both sides agree on. And then the courts say, because this was a part of collective bargaining, we will give it an exemption to some antitrust rules. And college sports doesn't have that. It doesn't have, there are no unions for athletes, and almost no unions in the industry at all. There's no mechanism to collectively bargain. There's no sides to talk through, and law doesn't currently permit it. So you end up having a system now where a lot of little decisions, from local judges to what one agent or one president or one coach might say. And I understand why that can be very confusing to follow along, whether you're a fan or for that matter, a coach or a player.
I mean, you mentioned your time at Fox, right, Matt? And you actually have some experience in how this might actually play out. So how tedious, tenuous, and realistic is it for college football to even get to a point where they have collective bargaining?
I would say it is going to be very difficult. And it's something that I think maybe some of my colleagues or other folks in the industry gloss over a little bit, because in other industries, management cannot create a union to negotiate with. If there's going to be somebody on the other side of the table to bargain with, the workers have to create that and to assemble it. And in college sports, I think there are two meaningful obstacles that prevent that right now. One is legal. Right now, as of this exact second while we're talking, college athletes are not considered employees by the current law. We can debate, and maybe you've had other people come on there who feel that the law should define it differently. Maybe that changes at some point. But right now, they're not employees. So they don't have the legal protections and the ability to engage in some of this kind of collective bargaining. But even if they were, then you have to actually band together. And one thing that I've learned in my career, I did a couple other things before I became a reporter. When I was a reporter at SB Nation, I was involved in the effort to help unionize that workplace. And labor organizing is very difficult because it requires lots of people with disparate interests, whether that's economic or elsewhere in your workplace, to come together and agree on one path forward. And this is a real problem even in smaller unions like professional basketball, because what's good for LeBron James and what's good for the 11th man on the Sacramento Kings are often not the same thing, right? One person wants salary floors and a salary cap, and the other person wants the ability to be paid $100 million in salary because LeBron might be able to command that. And that becomes part of the problem with even just one college football team. Even like just say Boise State, for example, you've got 100 people on the roster. You might have 10 or 15 of those folks who can legitimately see a pathway for them to play in the NFL or potentially maybe transfer to Ohio State or Texas or Alabama. And you've got a lot of other people who are very good college football players whose immediate trajectory is likely the CFL or being an extremely in shape insurance broker or salesperson or something, right? You know, a sales guy that can squat 700 pounds. And what you want is going to be very different from somebody who's likely to be a first or second round NFL draft pick. A college sports union then has to bring all these people together and do it in a way would be the youngest union and one of the most transient unions in the entire world. And that's not impossible, but that's not something that Danny White or Kirk Herbstreit or Greg Sankey or you or me can snap our fingers and create. I believe that has to be something that organically and meaningfully comes from the athletes themselves. And while that's happening more than it was in 2020 or 2021, that hasn't really happened yet. And we need to in order to get to a CBA.
Okay, my next question, I guess, right now we're at a point in the NCAA where, I mean, the athletes, they have a lot of freedom. There aren't a lot of restrictions, right? Whether it be how they're paid, when they're paid, or even eligibility for that matter. So if it has to organically even come from the athletes, Matt, why is that? Why is collective bargaining something that they would seek out or would benefit them?
I think a lot of that depends on what's important to you and what kind of athlete you are. You know, to go back here with the local football team example, like you're right. If you are a top 300 high school football recruit, if you're an all-conference Pac-12 player, I think it is probably true. You would enjoy more individual bargaining power independently than you would as part of a CBA necessarily or part of a union. But also, if you're a running back at Boise State, it's probably in your athletic and interest to have a good understanding of who's going to be on your offensive line next year. So you can decide where you want to be playing. And in a world that doesn't have structure, you might not have all the information or data you need to make the most informed decision for yourself. And that would certainly be true for other people who have different athletic careers or different spots on the roster. I think that's one of the big challenges in this entire debate is there's a group of people, and I don't dismiss them or disparage them in any way, but their professional interests, maybe they're an agent or an attorney, are mostly working with people, the top 500 or so recruits, or the top 500 or so football players in Division I, and they are going to have specific economic interests. But there's 11,000 plus college football players in just the FBS, and depending on how they feel about labor solidarity, depending on how they feel about predictability in the labor market, and how they feel about their academic careers or the ability to decide what they major in or how to ensure certain healthcare guarantees are slotted in, they might or might not benefit from a CBA as well. And I think it's important here. I'm not trying to be evasive in how I answer that question, but I very personally believe a lot of these things really fundamentally have to be argued and decided by the laborers themselves, the athletes, the students. Because I can sit here and say, well, this is a good deal or this isn't, but my mortgage doesn't depend on beating Fresno State, and I don't have to block anybody. No one's going to tackle me. So I feel like the people that actually have something at stake and something to lose should have the loudest, most prominent opinions about where to go next than somebody like me.
So maybe you just touched on it, Matt, but like in your opinion and given your experience at Fox, like what is the first step? And a fun question I always like to ask, like what is a realistic timeline on something like this even, being completed and implemented?
Yeah. And it's a good question. And what's permissible or possible may vary a little bit from state to state. So one thing that maybe is frustrating to hear from fans, but really does need to happen concurrently to this conversation, in my view, is legislative action. I know there's a lot of folks, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or something in between, that think, I don't really want Congress involved in college athletics. And I can tell you as a professional who talks to these guys, a lot of them don't follow college sports super closely. You and I and many of the people listening to this might have a better grasp on the details than some of the folks on these committees. But whether you want the SCORE Act or some of the antitrust protections the NCAA wants, or whether you want a collective bargaining agreement that includes some or all college athletes, there probably does need to be some changes in laws to allow that to happen, depending on who we decide the employer is, what kind of collective bargaining they're allowed to have, and who will protect it. And I think beyond then, whatever group of athlete we're talking about, whether it's women's basketball, men's basketball, everybody at Boise State, everybody in the Pac-12, whatever it decide to be, you come up with a bargaining unit, and then you're going to the students are going to have to work with some kind of outside organizer and talk amongst themselves and decide what is it fundamentally that we want. And maybe what they fundamentally want is not so much about compensation slots or a minimum amount of salary or anything, but it's about healthcare or about academics or about protection against an abusive coach or any number of other things. Once you have a group of people that have decided we want to work together on this and we've given ourselves some leverage, then this process can continue. And I think once enough college athletes do that, that would change the conversation about the law or about how schools would respond.
I mean, it might be a tough question to answer, Matt, but how far do you think we are away from getting enough of those people in a room or on the same page to actually force something to happen? Because, I mean, tweeting about supporting college athletics is one thing, but actually devoting time to fixing it is a completely other thing. And let's face it, a lot of these people that could make something happen, they have a lot of other topics, that they're trying to tackle at this moment in time as well.
Sure. I mean, regardless of how you feel about the president, I think a lot of us would agree, would probably rather the president be focused on something other than like Mountain West basketball or some, some way more local issues or something, right? Or for our senators or Congress people or anybody else. I don't think we're that close to making any of these kind of long-lasting, legally durable changes. I understand that there's more momentum in this direction than there was a couple of years ago, right? You have a group like athletes.org, which can say, hey, we now have thousands of current athletes who have expressed interest in banding together and sharing some common principles and working together on things, which might not have existed 3 or 4 years ago. And that's great. You probably need 3 or 4 times the number of people that have signed up for that before you have something that more meaningfully resembles a union. But the first step of getting there is getting a quarter of the people that you need. The tricky thing is in college sports, once you get those folks, they have this nasty habit of graduating or getting older, and then you have to bring in other people and constantly relitigate and reorganize. I think we will eventually get to that point, whether it's driven by the courts, driven by lawmakers, or driven up by the athletes themselves. But I would be very surprised if somebody came in on the white horse and changed everything in the next year. I think there's still a lot of very difficult and complicated organizational work to happen.
I think a thing that could be cool with collective bargaining too is maybe it also somewhat regulates a level-ish playing field, right? And this, my opinion, not necessarily yours, my opinion, a guy like Kirk Herbstreit, right? Like, I feel like for so long, him and Lee Corso have helped, us all understand the heartbeat of college football. And over the weekend, he made some comments about maybe the Power Four breaking off so that, essentially the rest of the schools could kind of organize their own thing. And then he mentioned collective bargaining after that split.
I think the Power Four needs to break away, create their own world, create their own governing body, allow the group of four to kind of create their own world.
I'm just curious, that those opinions are thrown out there to react to. And I'm just curious, your reaction to something like that. Does a split necessarily help collective bargaining happen? Are those two things necessary, or just your thoughts on that?
Sure. I certainly don't think that they're necessary. I understand the argument about how it might make it easier because you're helping to more closely define the bargaining unit or who's in the club and working together and being a part of that CBA. And I think that's a tacit acknowledgement that many of the economic needs and interests of a football player at Lafayette or at Texas State are fundamentally different from LSU or Texas or Ohio State. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to formally split off in order to have that happen. Nor do I think if there is a split, I don't think there's any reason to think that it has to be on the P4 lines. It might be much narrower than that, right? If I was a fan of Purdue or Kansas or Wake Forest, I would certainly not cheerlead efforts to have a formal breakaway because yesterday's Washington State could very well be tomorrow's Purdue for any of these sort of things. And suddenly you find yourself in a very different financial situation. You can have collective bargaining in any group of college football programs that you want. And just as a fan, as somebody who loves this sport, I wish that it was more egalitarian, not less. I enjoy college football as a reporter and as a fan far more than I enjoy the NFL. And part of it is because there's room for smaller programs and different fan bases to still have success and engage at a higher level than maybe there might be in some other sports. I mean, for God's sakes, Indiana just went undefeated and won a national championship. And I know that's not some poor mom and pop program, but you and I remember when, Indiana, if they were playing you guys, would have been a 21-point dog in most of the last 15 years. Like, they were bad. And then you change a couple of things, suddenly they're undefeated. And if they can do it, Lord knows there's 25 other programs outside the Big Ten, maybe outside the A4, that have enough resources to be able to do something similar.
Yeah. As long as we're talking about the divide, I mean, something that Boise State Director of Athletics Jeremiah Dickey has brought up a number of times is creating a criteria of what makes a school P4, right? Like, kind of as simple as that. And you mentioned some of those programs, even a Rutgers who, you wrote about, and it's on your website right now. Why is Rutgers so dang broke? I mean, we came out and they're hundreds of millions in the hole, right? Ever since they moved to the Big Ten. And I don't know, just your thoughts on the divide and how that needs to be defined as all this other stuff maybe potentially gets figured out too.
And honest to God, I think JD makes an important point when he says that. And he's not the only athletic director I've heard raise that exact same concern. I've heard that from Colorado State. I've heard that from San Diego State. I've heard that from schools in the MAC and the American Athletic, right? Where it's, all right, if we have some kind of proverbial divide now, and we know money has something to do with it because some people get 56 million or whatever from Fox or ESPN and other people clearly don't. But what are the definitive characteristics that separate us? Because we know it's not just on the field success. Whether it's Boise or whether it's Tulane or whether it's James Madison or any number of other programs have done more on the field than Purdue or some ACC or Big 12 institutions in recent memory. If it's about facilities or if it's about total spending, I think you can define that. And you're going to have some schools maybe many in the MAC that would say, that's great. We can't meet that. Bowling Green is a great school. It's great for lots of different things. They're never going to be a $200 million athletic department budget. And if that's the line, I think our friends at Bowling Green would say, okay, we need to be on this side of the line. But there are other schools, potentially this one, potentially Memphis, potentially others in the new Pac-12 that would say, if you give us a benchmark, we'll make the investments. We can go out to our business community, our alumni, and we'll meet it. And I understand a lot of the frustration with an inability to nail some of those things down because, quite frankly, I think elitism is part of that, where it isn't so much about this school doesn't have the money or the resources so much as this school is a truck driving academy a few decades ago, or this school didn't make the right friends in 1915, and we don't want to let them into the club. I think that's anti-American, not to get too far over my skis or anything, but that's part of what will be litigated and discussed as we figure out where college football is going to be.
Well, now that you've given us a little bit better understanding of the challenges of collective bargaining, Matt, if you were put in charge of fixing college football, what is the first thing you would do?
Besides resign, not want that kind of responsibility. I joke with people, if I really knew all the answers, my newsletter would be so much more expensive. I would be in a very different line of work. I'd be, drinking something tropical somewhere. But if I couldn't quit and I was drafted into this kind of position, I would be sitting down with a lot of lawmakers of both political parties and saying like, okay, now we have to come up with an agreement. And I've pitched a couple of maybe compromises or proposals on extra points. I personally don't think it makes a lot of sense to make every single college athlete an employee. A lot of them legitimately don't want that. The increased expenses in Social Security and workers' comp and some of the other payroll taxes, I think would make sponsoring large athletic departments very difficult for your median Big Sky institution or your typical ASUN kind of school. Do I think you could do it for football and men's and women's basketball and some other sports? Yeah, but you could also just make craft a new exception to the federal, the Fair Labor Standards Act that gives a special exemption to college athletes or allow them to collectively bargain without being employees. We let other individual subgroups do that. I think there is a way to get athletes and administrators and television people and lawmakers and presidents in a room, lock the door, get however much pizza and beer that we need or a Red Bull to figure this out and find some ways to preserve what so much of us love about this institution of college athletics, while still allowing people to be paid what they deserve or what's fair for helping build that value. When we have so many people trying to solve this right now that only are responsible for a sliver of that, and I think that's why we don't really have any kind of holistic solutions. And athletes, by and large, are mostly left out of those conversations right now.
Well, before I get you out of here, Matt, I want you to make one more extra point here as it pertains to Boise State. And
Sure.
just their position in the current college football landscape. What maybe encourages you about it, and what's a challenge that you see for them moving forward?
Sure. I think the challenge is similar to so many of your peers, including some aspirational peers. Stuff's expensive. And when I say stuff, I don't just mean athlete salaries, although that continues to be expensive. And I think people in this market know you're not going to be able to pay everybody on your team the same amount of money that Oregon or USC are necessarily paying. But lots of other things are expensive. Construction equipment is more expensive. Specialized administrator talent is more expensive. Healthcare has become more expensive. And you have to balance that with not wanting to pass all of those costs on to your fans, because people still want to be able to bring their kids to your basketball games. And that's a difficult push-pull. How can we find more nickels and dimes in the couch cushions? What else can we sell that's not going to alienate our fans? How can we generate more of that revenue? That is a significant problem if your athletic budget's under $80 million, and it's one that a lot of other people are facing. But I think where I would take some good cheer is that this market and this institution has real fans. It has people that are going to go not just when football is being very successful, but will go to basketball, that will invest in Olympic sports, that care about tennis, and will be at this at the stadium no matter what. You have people that are willing to give not just cash, but time and emotional energy to support the program. And I think you have coaches and you have administrators and leaders that are willing to sell the gospel of the Boise State Broncos everywhere, to every Cub Scout troop and every new family from California that just moved to Idaho and now needs to adopt a new team. And I see you smiling, but like, this is so much of that hustle, which, while unglamorous at times, I really believe is fundamental to building a lasting fan base. And that's something that maybe some folks here in the Midwest might have neglected a little bit. And it's much harder to build that than it is to figure out, how can I make some more money selling sponsorships? How can I find the right logo to put on my jersey? How am I going to be able to pay for what I want to do at gymnastics? Those are difficult but solvable problems. And boy, they're so much easier to solve if you have enough people who really care about your school. And that's what I think the Broncos have.
Well, Matt, as kids, we learn that knowledge is power. This is such a complex but important topic as we try to figure out the future of college football. So we appreciate you joining us on Broncos Studios to help educate ourselves and even our viewers here in Boise a little bit better on the topic. So thanks for your time today. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Coming up next, Boise State Assistant Professor Sam Ehrlich stops by Broncos Studios. Sam is an ex-lawyer who now enjoys sports law, so much so that a couple of years ago, he started his own website called collegesportslitigationtracker.com. Sam, we appreciate you joining us inside Broncos Studios to help further this discussion. And, just your broad take of this real quick. The chaos in college sports, how much do you enjoy monitoring it?
Well, enjoy may be a strong word. Enjoy may be, I don't want to necessarily take pleasure out of the, all the chaos that's going on, but it's something that I really do. Maybe enjoy is the wrong word, but I'll use it. I do enjoy kind of following all this stuff. It really kind of, touches on a lot of my research interests in terms of just the legal side of college athletics. And a lot of these cases are just fascinating in general. Mm-hmm. They're just really interesting to follow. They involve these really, important fact patterns, and I really think kind of getting at the heart of what exactly is the NCAA's power in this current age. Mm-hmm. With all the judicial intervention. It's an interesting question. It's an important question. It's one that, even if I'm not necessarily eager to see the NCAA go down, it's one where I think all of us are looking for answers. And I think, as we get more and more of these court cases, we kind of chip away to find that answer.
Just about you really quick here. When did you decide to start collegesportslitigationtracker.com?
Yeah, so I started it back in around October of 2023, or 2024, excuse me. And it was really something where I was hoping for my research. I do all this research into college sports law. I do all this research into, following these court cases. And I've kind of been doing it on my own, just through, just getting email updates from a lot of these cases. But there wasn't really kind of a one-stop kind of repository of, all these different cases in one place, being able to access it, look at all these documents. You have to go back into Pacer. You have to go back into all these databases to, pull all these documents. And I frankly found that pretty annoying. So I just wanted to kind of lay it out in all in one place. And it was something, I shout out to, two of my field colleagues, Neil Turnus at Northern Illinois and Joe Saban at Southeastern Louisiana. They were also kind of like, this would be a really good idea. Like, I could really use this. And it actually took me a few months to make it public because I just kind of had it as in my own kind of thing for a while. And then I was blown away by how many people have been using it and how many people find it, find it helpful. Mm-hmm. And it makes me keep wanting to do it and keep wanting to do it. And just in general, I love the positive reinforcement. I'm glad it's something that's helpful to other people as well.
If you look at like how this NFL is covered, right? Like, obviously the season is fantastic, but then there are always these lines that pop up in the off season that keep us entertained 365 days. And I feel like that's kind of where college athletics is moving to, where there is no off season. There's always a story to cover. So why did you pick like these stories? Like, have you always been passionate about sports, Sam, or do you just like this side of, the legal matter, I suppose?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, I've always been passionate about sports, but I've always really enjoyed and really especially enjoyed the kind of the behind the scenes part of sports, and especially the legal side of sports as well. I used to joke, with my parents growing up, my favorite day of the year is July 31st, which is the trade deadline, and also for baseball, Major League Baseball trade deadline, and also it's kind of an ancillary, side thing. It's also my birthday. Okay. So I've always just been that guy. I've always just been that person, and I always loved reading about kind of the labor issues that were involved, even as a little kid, which is kind of weird to say, the labor issues of the 70s with the Mesut-McNally decision back in, back in 72 for Major League Baseball, and just all that stuff. And of course, now that we're seeing kind of similar echoes of it in college sports, of these labor issues, of this kind of tension between antitrust law and labor rights, it's something that I've been incredibly drawn to in college sports as well. And of course, doesn't hurt the fact that I'm also a big college sports fan as well.
How important is it just to have these discussions? I mean, that's a big reason why we're doing this right now, right? Like, it's so funny because I think that you see athletic directors, college coaches, they'll talk about these topics in their post-game press conferences or whatever, and they say we need collective bargaining, and it's almost like it's discussed in a matter of like, oh, well, let's get on the same page and we can figure it out by the end of the week. But it is such a complex matter, right? So when it comes to collective bargaining, one of the biggest topics, what do you view as the benefits and potential hurdles? Let's start with benefits of collective bargaining.
Yeah, and first of all, these conversations are vital. Like, the reason why I was kind of pulling back on saying, I'm eager to talk about these things, I'm excited to talk about things, I love following this, is because I know how much this makes life difficult for administrators, coaches, and even players. Like, I get messages from players on Twitter all the time, asking me about eligibility cases and asking me, how is Pavi or Patterson or, all these different cases, how is it going to affect them? And I understand there's a lot of confusion right now. And it makes it so challenging to be anywhere in this space because you just don't know. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know whether this Charles Bediako situation in Alabama is going to affect the broader landscape or not. You don't know if now that Chambliss got his year of eligibility, is that also going to affect Joey Aguilar? Like, there's just so many unanswered questions, and it really doesn't help that there's so much uncertainty and there's so much inconsistency even in these eligibility cases about what's going to come next. And I think that's the biggest benefit of collective bargaining right there, is you have certainty, you have stability, and you have a system where you're giving players their voice. You're giving the ability for players to come in through the representatives to say, this is what we think college athletics should look like. This is what we want to see. This is what we want to get in return for all these different things that we're going to give you, like the ability to enforce eligibility rules, which are right now questionably enforceable, like the ability to perhaps potentially, go back to a year of residence rule where, you can have one transfer but not anything more than that, to enforce the house element, which again, the third party benefits part of it, where you have, this fair market value requirement, you have this valid business purpose requirement. Whether that's even enforceable or not is an open question. And collective bargaining solves all that, because collective bargaining, the NCAA has been hunting for this antitrust exemption to shield them from all the lawsuits, and the vast majority of the lawsuits have been based in antitrust law. The Alston decision, which really tore all this open at the Supreme Court, was based in antitrust law. The NCAA wants very badly to have some sort of antitrust exemption, and collective bargaining gives you the non-statutory labor exemption, which is that antitrust exemption.
So if this is such a popular idea, it is positively received overall, it seems. What is preventing it from happening? What are happening? What are the hurdles, Sam?
There are two major hurdles here, and they are really, to start things off, they are really major hurdles. There's a logistical reason why collective bargaining hasn't happened on both sides of the equation, and there's a legal reason why it hasn't happened. Logistical reason is very simply neither side particularly wants it right now, and there's a lot of movement from certain organizations like athletes.org. Jim Cavalli, of course, is on this program. There are other organizations as well, the CFPPA, CFPPA is one of them. There's all these different organizations out there that are trying to angle to get kind of some space in terms of being that Major League Baseball Players Association, being that organization, or at least being one of these organizations, and maybe a multifaceted collective bargaining agreement. But the problem is you don't have enough buy-in from the players yet. And I think there's honestly good reason for it. First of all, it's incredibly difficult to get college students to unionize in the first place. Just the nature of the nature of the beast when you have 18 to 22 year olds, and also simply the fact that if you're a college athlete right now, especially if you're the ones with the most leverage, if you're a power 2 college football player, why on earth would you want to unionize right now? when you could just file lawsuits over eligibility and over all these different things and potentially win these lawsuits. The fact of the matter is you're getting this antitrust exemption through collective bargaining, but why would you want a collective bargaining, or why would you want this antitrust exemption if you're in that position? And maybe we get to a point where stability is valued more than the ability to kind of sue from everything. But I also understand the perspective from an athlete's perspective where, yes, that stability is important, but if I'm looking specifically for my situation and I'm Joey Aguilar and I'm like, I want another year, and if there's a collective bargaining agreement that allows the NCAA to enforce these rules, then I'm not going to get that other year. But now I can file a lawsuit and perhaps get it. Then again, why would I want to join a union and give all that up? So those are the logistical reasons, and of course it also gets to the other side of the equation where the NCAA doesn't want it. The NCAA is adamantly opposed to consideration of employment status. They're adamantly opposed to collective bargaining in general, and they don't want to necessarily give up the power that they have over college sports. So again, why would they do it either?
I know you really specialize in the eligibility part of this, and to focus on that for just a second. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Maurice Clarett was trying to petition that he could go to the NFL early, right? Mm-hmm. And now you have guys that have already been in college for 5, even 6 years that are trying to find a way to earn more additional eligibility because, quite frankly, they can probably earn more in college than, roll the dice at whatever the next level is. Just how wild is it? I mean, we are talking about probably a 20-year span now between, whatever Maurice Clarett tried to attempt to do with his eligibility and what athletes are doing now. But it's just like it is crazy how much it's shifted.
Yeah, and I think actually Maurice Clarett is such a perfect example of everything that's, all parts of this conversation for a variety of different reasons. One, exactly what you said, where, if you think back 20 years ago, back to 2003, 2004, when Maurice Clarett was trying to get into the NFL and he was filing this lawsuit to get into the NFL, where again, it's completely shifted now. But it's also a perfect example of kind of the power of collective bargaining in general and the stability that's provided by collective bargaining. Because I think it's important to remember, and I think a lot of people forget this, Clarett actually won initially. He actually, at the district court level, the district court ruled in favor of Clarett. They granted an injunction that allowed him to enter the draft. But it went to the appeal, or it went on appeal to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Second Circuit said, no, actually this is part of collective bargaining agreement, so therefore it's, this age rule is immune from antitrust law, which is the theory that Clarett was suing under, which is the theory that the vast majority of these eligibility rule cases are based on. Because you had a collective bargaining agreement, because you had, judicial deference to that collective bargaining agreement, the NFL was able to prevail in that litigation, which, again, perfect example of what we're talking about here.
Why would the NFL want to keep him out? I guess that would be my question, but I know it's part of the collective bargaining agreement. I guess that maybe goes back to the players, too, for that matter.
It does.
How about the fact that, we look at the state of Idaho as a right-to-work state. So how do you feel like collective bargaining would go over in the state of Idaho?
And that's the other side of it, where I talked about the logistical barriers. That's the legal barrier, where right now it is not legally feasible. It's not legally possible to have collective bargaining across college sports. That's very simple to say, because if we look at professional sports, if we look at the NFL, if we look at Major League Baseball, if we look at the NWSL, if you look at the WNBA, all these different professional organizations, they're private organizations. And private organizations are covered by the National Labor Relations Act, which is the federal law governing collective bargaining, governing unionization. And that's all well and good. It's all, makes it a lot easier to kind of unionize and easier to, still not easy, but at least legally feasible to do that and have this multi-employer bargaining unit, which is the NFL or the NFL Management Council specifically. But in college sports, you're not just dealing with private actors. You're not just dealing with private employers, if you want to call them employers, because you have not just Stanford, which is a private organization, or Northwestern, which was, the first, major push for unionization was back in 2014, 2015 with Northwestern football players. They could unionize, they could file a petition to the National Labor Relations Board because it was a private employer. But for public employers, for state employers, for government employers like Boise State University, for example, and especially when you're talking about this right to work consideration, this right to work state law consideration, for one, public employees are not covered under the NLRA. So it wouldn't be something that would be subject to the National Labor Relations Board's jurisdiction. And for two, that means that state law is going to govern, and state law that in a lot of states, including Idaho and Utah and several other states as well, public employees can't, maybe they can unionize. It really depends on that state law, but a lot of the times they can't collectively bargain. And for example, like if you go back to Northwestern, if you go back to that decision, I think what everyone kind of forgets about the decision is the NLRA or the NLRB, excuse me, didn't say these football players are not employees, they can't unionize. They said, we don't think it's appropriate for us to assert jurisdiction here because Northwestern is only one school in this larger group. And at the time, as they pointed out, Northwestern was the only school in the Big Ten that was a private entity. The rest of them were all public. Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, Illinois, Iowa. Got to throw in Iowa there, otherwise my friend Neil is gonna kill me. All these other institutions in the Big Ten are public employers. They're government employers, and therefore the NLRB doesn't have jurisdiction. So they said picking one school out of here and picking one school to say we're going to assert jurisdiction here is not productive. It's not something that's going to help labor relations in this space. So we're not going to do it. And they completely left open the idea of whether college athletes are employees, whether they can unionize, because they felt like this was the bigger issue, and that still has not been resolved.
Yeah. So I mean, in when we talk about collective bargaining in the state of Idaho, you said that in all 50 states it probably wouldn't be possible to bring it all together. Now you're when you say that you're kind of mean under the letter of the law as it stands right now, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. Yeah,
so
as it stands right now.
Is there something that could realistically happen that might open the door? And I'm going to emphasize realistically happen.
There's really two paths to make it happen. One would be, Jennifer Abruzzo, who is the general counsel of the NLRB under the Biden administration. So a few years ago, she wrote a memo that talked about college athlete employment, talked about the prospect of college athlete unionization. And in it, there's a footnote in there that was really compelling to a lot of people. And I think that footnote will end up kind of standing the test of time more than the actual memo will, which is kind of interesting, where she brought up the possibility, and this has been something that's been proposed by academics as well, the possibility that you could consider the conferences and or the NCAA as joint employers and have them, they're all private entities, have them kind of be the employers in this case where the states, are part of it. But perhaps that's an area where the NLRB can assert jurisdiction, can say, because we have this joint employment situation, because part of this equation is private employers like, the Big Ten, the ACC, the Mountain West, the Pac-12, because those are private employers, we can have jurisdiction here. We can have a broader collective bargaining agreement here. But that's a very untested theory. It's one that, was based on kind of the Biden administration's kind of conception of joint employment. That has shifted under the Trump administration. The NLRB under the Trump administration has kind of shifted that definition and made it a lot harder to assert joint employment. So either they would have to cede ground or they would have to kind of carve out something different there, or just, there would have to be some kind of litigation to kind of make it happen. And we are seeing that. The Johnson v. NCAA employment law litigation does have a joint employment claim, claiming that the NCAA is a joint employer here. So, it's based on a different field of law, Fair Labor Standards Act instead of the NLRA, but perhaps that could be transmuted over. The other ground is federal legislation. Where you could have Congress step in and say, we're going to carve out a part of the NLRA. We're going to say in the NLRA that college athletes, even if they are at public institutions, can unionize, can be part of a collective bargaining agreement, and are covered by the jurisdiction of the NLRB. Whether that actually happens or not, I would say it's very doubtful. I hesitate to even say it because you were very, very strict. Make it realistic.
Yeah.
And I think trying to get both sides to agree that college athletes can unionize, probably a bit of a stretch.
How important do you think the next 18 to 24 months are when it comes to college sports? And we'll pick the long end of that one. So 2 years from now, basically, what do you think the discussion is? Where do you think we stand with collective bargaining?
I think we get closer to it. I think there gets to be a lot more willingness to do it. For example, I talked earlier about, why would college athletes want to unionize right now? I think one thing that they may look at is situations like with Damon Williams and Darian Mensah, where they were, Damon Williams was threatened with a lawsuit. Darian Mensah was actually sued by his old institution over wanting to leave in the middle of the contract. And I think as questions like that continue to arise, and questions like the enforceability of these contracts and the prospect of, and this is exactly what led to collective bargaining in the NBA, or at least led to the NBA ABA merger. The idea that if you do contract hopping, if you hop from one contract to another, well, we saw it with Rick Barry and we saw it with Dr. J. They actually got injunctions against them saying, you can't play for this new institution, you can't play for this new team because you're still under contract. You gave exclusive rights to your old team. That's exactly what's being threatened in the Mensah situation and the Williams situation. And if that ever goes to court, if that doesn't end up in a settlement as both the Williams and the Mensah situation did, if we have a situation where a player is literally enjoined from being able to play for a new institution, maybe that's something where collective bargaining becomes a lot more appealing for the player side. Maybe that's something where both sides say, okay, we've had enough of this chaos. Let's try to get some stability here. But again, a lot of that needs to happen. And I think it's also important to kind of consider the political landscape as well, what that's going to look like in 18 and 24 months. Whether there is movement on new legislation, whether there's a continued push to get the SCORE Act passed, which right now doesn't look like it's going to be able to pass. The SCORE Act would completely neuter the idea of collective bargaining in general. It would completely eliminate that as a possibility, and it would and really make it so the NCAA doesn't need it because they'd have their antitrust immunity in all the areas where it matters to them. So if the SCORE Act ends up passing, then collective bargaining is no longer necessarily going to be a thing. Potentially it could be, but it's certainly a lot of the incentive would be taken away. But maybe there's something where in kind of the desire for Congress to pass something, they can find some sort of compromise. And, I know I'm asking for a lot there.
One more for you, Sam. And this question didn't really hit me until about midway through our conversation. If collective bargaining does become a thing and there are rules put in place and eligibility rules are established, what happens to collegesportslitigationtracker.com?
Well, it becomes a lot more quiet. Like you may have noticed, the timeline of when thinking back to when we were talking about the timeline of when I created the tracker. Mm-hmm. This is before all that eligibility rule stuff. Yeah. That made it a lot. Definitely made it a lot more challenging to keep track of this litigation as soon as those now 50 plus lawsuits started happening, especially since so many of them are in state courts, and it's hard to follow state court litigation in a lot of states. But honestly, the tracker is there because we're having all this litigation. Mm-hmm. The tracker is there because we need to be able to track this litigation. If we get to a point where the tracker is no longer needed anymore, I think that would be welcome to a lot of people in the industry. If we get to collective bargaining, though, of course, we're still seeing litigation like the NFL. I still imagine there's going to be plenty to track and plenty more to write about from my research standpoint as well.
Well, Sam, I enjoy your work. We appreciate you swinging by Bronco Studios and helping us dive into a topic that means a lot right now to the college sports landscape.
Of course, my pleasure, Jay. Thanks so much for having me.
That is going to do it for this special episode from Inside Broncos Studios. I'd like to give a special thanks to Jeremiah Dickey, Jim Cavall, Matt Brown, and Sam Ehrlich for their contributions to this important discussion. Until next time, I'm Jay Tust from Broncos Studios.